Welcome to this week's episode of Resisting the Dragon's Beast. So, Peter, I finished listening to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde this week. Have you
Oh,
ever
good
read that
for
one?
you. I have. We had that in book club at the beginning of the year.
Yeah. I wasn't really a big fan of it. But toward the end, it got more interesting. It was hard to pay attention listening to it. But what I took from it, it was a good Lutheran or good Christian viewpoint of the two natures. Except
Yes.
what you would think the way uh, Dr. Jekyll explains things is that Mr. Hyde is like his sinful nature and you just keep feeding the beast and so forth. But as the sinful nature got worse and worse, the more you fed it, and it began taking over him, even when he wasn't necessarily taking the drugs and so forth. And that's the way our sinful nature is. I thought what was interesting with Robert Louis Stevenson, who is the author, is he didn't make Dr. Jekyll become better and better, more sanctified, like we would say. Is he stayed the same, and then the sinful nature of Mr. Hyde got worse and worse. Is that how you took the book?
Yeah, I would definitely agree that the more he indulges in this, the less control that he has. Where, we think we have control over the bad things that we do, but by the end of the book, he loses all control over the bad thing that he does, and he can't even stay like Dr. Jekyll anymore.
Right. Do you read anything interesting?
Um, I'm sure I'm sure I have. Nothing's coming to mind right now. I'm still working through Don Quixote. That's going to take me a while.
That will take you a while.
That will take me a long while. I'd have to check my Goodreads to see what else I'm reading right. Oh, we're reading the Oxbow incident. That is for our book club book for next week, Thursday. The Oxbow incident. It's a Western, but the back of the cover says that the Oxbow incident is to Westerns as the Maltese Falcon is to mysteries. And so there's a Henry Fonda movie. It's only about right around an hour long. But the Oxbow incident is a fantastic book, especially for like young people, teenagers. It's a fairly quick read. It's a Western. It's kind of fun. But it is really for talking about standing up for what is right in the face of pressure to do what is wrong.
Wow,
And
that's a good
yeah.
segue to the very first question we're going to talk about today.
All right, let's take it.
So, Peter, we're often tempted to remain safe. Why is it important to remember that Christianity, by its essence, is unsafe?
Yeah, because we want to go through life thinking that we are in control, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We want to think that there's no danger that can touch me because I live in the safest country or the safest time or whatever statistic you want to quote. But that Christianity is inherently unsafe because we are sinful people, and the devil and his demons around us, they would want to kill us or drag us away from Jesus in any way possible. And so we want to go through life with blinders on, like, there's nothing that can hurt me. I don't have to worry about anything. I know where my next meal is coming from. I don't smoke and I wear my seatbelt. I must be safe. Religiously, that is definitely not the case.
Yeah, and I go to when I think of Christianity being unsafe, I think of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. When the children ask Mr. Beaver about Aslan the lion, is he safe? And Mr. Beaver says, of course he isn't safe, but he is good. Uh, Peter wrote to his apostles, to people who were unsafe in positions that were being persecuted. When Paul or when Peter's writing his epistles, that's to Christians that are living in persecution. It's important to whenever you read those, and those oftentimes come up during the Easter season. They didn't come up this year, but oftentimes that's the Easter season epistle lessons. And this persecution isn't new. And just a couple of examples just from this week of persecution of Christians. Have you heard of Lauren Handy?
I no, I don't.
Okay, so I actually had a member ask me this morning if I was going to talk about her in Bible study this week, because she was found guilty of keeping people away from an abortion clinic in DC, where babies were found that had been born and then killed. And yet, the Republicans in Congress, they fought to have those babies studied and so forth to find out who the killer was. They knew it was a doctor. And then the Biden administration had them destroyed. They didn't want any talk about this. So there was no persecution or prosecution of the abortion clinic or the doctor that committed murder, both preborn and then killing the children that were born. Instead, Lauren Handy is one of those that was arrested and found this all out, and then has now been tried and convicted, and now is facing 5 years in prison.
Wow. Kind of reminds you, if you've ever read Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Telltale Heart,
Mm-hmm.
that that if we don't truly believe that there's no such thing as right and wrong, but as long as nobody points it out, then we can just quiet our conscience by doing other things. But if Lauren Handy's like, but there was a person here, and even according to the law of the land, that person has entered society when they have fully exited the birth canal, when they are, fully born out of the mother, and therefore it is murder. And they need to. It's an attempt to keep up the charade that that I have the right to exercise power, which is a postmodern concept, as opposed to the Christian understanding that I exercise power in service, first of all, and that the death of a child at any point, committed by somebody else, is murder. And they're just trying to keep up the charade that because the conscience is there, the telltale heart says murder happened. This person, the blood of your brother is crying out from the land.
Yeah. And so as Christians, we might, because we want to be safe, say, well, Lauren Handy and these other Christians, they should have found other ways of doing these kinds of things.
Yeah.
No, we have to stand up, especially for those who are weakest in our society. And there is nothing weaker in creation than a human baby.
Hmm.
We are called to protect them. And if it means being put in jail, well, God bless Lauren Handy and the others who are willing to do that when we're not willing to do it. And then, I don't know, have you heard all of the uproar this week, Peter, about Harrison Butker?
Was he the Catholic man who spoke at a Catholic university in a Catholic commencement concert, vocalizing Catholic doctrine, and people don't like hearing doctrine?
That's it.
Is that the one?
That
Okay.
is. Yeah, so he is the kicker for the uh, Super Bowl champions, the Kansas City Chiefs. And I read somewhere how one of his teammates, one who happens to be dating Taylor Swift, that he, at his commencement speech, encouraged everyone to drink beer and even chugged a beer then and there. And yet nothing was said about that. But yeah, someone who is promoting Christian doctrine. And, how he is being lambasted by everywhere and everyone on the left and so forth. They're trying to dox him. They're trying to get him fired. The Kansas City Chiefs, the NFL have all come out to speak against him. It makes me really say, I don't need to watch any NFL. And then I just read this article before we started recording that one of the ladies on The View, because that's where the left gets all their ideas, is the brilliant ladies on The View. She is saying that the Catholics who go to and follow Catholic teaching and worship in the Catholic Mass, that they are extremist. And so it is,
Extremists.
yeah, extremist. Oh,
Hmm.
and I heard this, I hadn't thought of this. I heard a podcast recently. You would know more about this, Peter, is that even our government leaders, they talk about the freedom of worship versus the freedom of religion. Have you heard that?
Oh boy, and that came up a little bit during COVID. And the yeah, I'll talk about this a little bit. First Amendment. One of the five freedoms of the First Amendment is the freedom of religion, and the way it's written, if you read the context, as is the case with all the other amendments, especially in the Bill of Rights, it's easier to see there that these are rights that are preserved for the people where the government does not have the authority to interfere. And if you read back to English common law, the tradition of some of these rights dates back to the Magna Carta. Roughly, I don't know, 500 years before our Constitution was written, but the entire mindset is of preserving a right for the people from government intrusion, and that shifted. I think we talked about this, probably 10 or 15 episodes back, talking about, Thomas Jefferson's idea and that was kind of picked up by the Supreme Court, of this wall of separation between church and state. And it has come full circle now, where the First Amendment right to the freedom of religion is not a freedom of the person to be free from government intervention in the practice of their faith, but rather the freedom of the populace at large, the people in the public square, to be free from whatever religious ideas that they don't like. And this is a huge shift, because the entire premise of a democratic republic, the entire premise of our system of governance, is based on and predicated on the idea of the free exchange of ideas, which is why one of the other five freedoms of the First Amendment is the freedom of speech, where the government, and the freedom of the press, where the government doesn't have the right to direct what you say or to limit what you can print, aside from slander and libel and that sort of thing. And so this is a relatively new development, at least as far as gaining popularity, that where the left in particular, whatever your politics may be, I've only ever really heard it from politicians on the left who identify with the left, is that they will refer to it purposefully as freedom of worship, not freedom of religion. And they'll say, well, you can keep your religion in your church building because that is your freedom of worship. You are free to worship. And it's the exact same train of thought as the government shutdowns during the Barack Obama administration, because they didn't pass a spending bill or something administrative like that. I don't remember. But they closed down outdoor national parks that did not need staffing, and they cordoned off an area that was called the free speech zone, where if you want to protest this closure, then you need to stand over there if you want to, because that's the free speech zone. And what it is taking a right that belongs to the people and turning it around into a privilege that is granted by the government. And therefore, we have the right to limit the concept to a practice instead of an actual right that belongs to you. It's a very dangerous idea, very limited because if it is allowed to stand, especially in this next generation with Supreme Court rulings coming at the end of next month, there will be some fun ones in that. But it's a very dangerous idea because then it has implications, like for the Hobby Lobby case, has implications for the Little Sisters of the Poor case, which was contraception in the Obamacare. Like, why would the Little Sisters of the Poor, these nuns who have taken a vow of celibacy and are never marrying, why would their insurance provider be required to provide contraception options to them? But where it really goes then is, there will be no freedom of religion, freedom of practicing your religion outside of the bounds of your building. And it's terrible. And I'll stop talking, or else I'll talk all day about this.
Well, and so I just heard that phrase, and I hadn't heard it before, or at least didn't think of it. And so I want to have our listeners got to listen very carefully and very closely the way our government leaders and our media who work together for these things, how they are changing language. And then, like you said, limiting rights. So for example, changing it from freedom of religion to freedom of worship. We saw a video several months ago in England where a female police officer was telling Christians that they couldn't be outside praying and speaking their faith and saying, no, that's for church. That's the freedom of worship. And so you hear that more and more of keep your religion out of politics, keep your religion out of culture, whatever. No, that's
Mhm.
exactly the wrong thing. And that's what we talked about in the last episode. Perhaps we're where we are right now because we have kept our faith out of uh, and kept our religion out of politics, kept it out of culture. And so going with that language, again, it's very much like 1984. So I encourage the listeners to read that because I was listening to a podcast today too of Dr. Fauci and then how he was being grilled and so forth about gain of function research in the Wuhan lab as far as the COVID uh, the COVID-19. And he said, well, it depends on your definition of gain of function. Well, no, you just use the definition we've always used of gain of function. And it's always these changing of terms. So watch out for that.
Yeah, and the big thing, as a Christian, you can say to yourself and hold on to this truth that on the one hand, I don't care what the government says. I don't care what restrictions they may enforce. I don't care what persecution comes my way because Jesus is king. I've got heaven. I've got the responsibility to confess and lock me up, drag me before the synagogue. Let me testify before the rulers. It is totally fine to hold on to that, and please do plant that truth firmly in your heart and read about it. Let's memorize some things so that you have this Bible ready at hand in your mind. Memorize Psalm 46, and then learn how to sing it in A Mighty Fortress. But it is also, I would go so far as to say it's also not okay to discourage your fellow Christians from exercising the rights that they have, because these rights that have been granted and preserved for the citizens of our country, that we don't have the right to tell our fellow Christians, you shouldn't be doing that because Christians don't do that. Well, as a Christian citizen, this right belongs to you, which is exactly, and so we need to exercise this right, even if it's to the point of uncomfort or discomfort. And this came up, for instance, when we were talking about conscientious objection and vaccination, where some in even conservative circles or liberal circles in religious circles, let's say, some in religious circles would say, well, you can't say that you don't want this vaccine because our church body doesn't have a stand on that. Our church body has said it's okay. This or that professor or teacher or paper said that it was okay for Christians to get a vaccine. That doesn't matter. As a citizen of this country, these things all have specific legal definitions. Okay, that's number one. They have specific legal definitions. Number two, and they are defined not just in the Constitution, but in the case law, the relevant case law of the cases that apply to these questions about the Constitution. And so the exercise of religion is a personal and individual right that if a person said, and it's really the framers of the Constitution saying that the government doesn't have the right to dictate your conscience. That if any person, even if they have no religion at all, says that I don't feel right with this, then the government doesn't have the right to compel it, and those who would compel it, even within our own church body, who would say, well, you can't say that you don't have this because it's not in the book of Galatians that you cannot, fill in the blank, that you have to have this vaccine or something like that, because it is a legal civic right, that it is legally protected. And if any of our schools were to compel their professors or teachers or students to receive, for instance, because this is the most pertinent at-hand example, if they were to compel our professors, teachers, or students to get a vaccination in order to participate there, then that would be religious discrimination. Even within the same church body, but legally it would be. And that would be a terrible place for somebody to go just walking blindly. Or on the other hand, it would be a terrible place for somebody whose conscience says, I don't feel comfortable with this. I think stewardship of the body means that I want to see how this all plays out over the next few years. And the religious freedom that we have as Christians is different from the civic legal protection that is afforded in religious freedom. And the religious freedom that we have as Americans, in a civic sense, is more broad and far reaching with legal implications on both sides when that is respected or not. And so what you've got is both a curtailing of the terminology as well as a flip of where the freedom actually begins. And you see this in the contrast with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where the Canadian Charter grants privileges to the people, that those privileges can be suspended whenever the Canadian government wants. The American Constitution preserves these rights for the people, preserves them from government intrusion. And so it's actually a twofold attack against the rights of American citizens to say, number one, that it is freedom of worship, not freedom of religion, and number two, this is a privilege that we can suspend. We haven't gotten to the point where our government has agreed that these are privileges that we can suspend, but it just depends on who's in power.
Well, and with that last part of suspending privileges, even suspending rights, again, there is a story in New York of a man, an engineer, who is having parts of guns shipped to him, and so with the parts, there's no serial numbers and so forth, and so people in the present administration and so forth call this a ghost gun because it sounds scary. And then he was arrested, and he's being tried and probably to be put in prison for like 10 years and so forth for something that should be legal. Mm-hmm. Because he's putting these guns together in his apartment, and now that's supposedly illegal. And again, where Christians might say, well, then he shouldn't be doing that because there's a law against it. No, it's a law that is unlawful according to the Second Amendment, where we have the rights to have weapons and so forth.
And that one's going to be really interesting because, first of all, the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, is a bureaucratic institution that gets to write its own rules, and that there's no pushback, or there's no repercussions, rather, when they redefine terminology. And that is going to be one, hopefully, you'll probably hear something from, I would say, for sure from Justice Gorsuch when this round of SCOTUS decisions are laid out for us here in June, because there's a case before the Supreme Court right now. To what extent do these administrative bureaucratic organizations have the right to determine the terms for the enforcement of the law? And to what extent does that responsibility rest with the lawmakers, who have to define what they mean instead of just throwing word salad and then tossing it over to the bureaucratic organization who gets to redefine terms left and right? If you follow anything that the ATF has done in the last 5 or 10 years, you could say at every point, if the average American has, like, let's say 5 or 6 weapons, guns, doesn't matter, in various configurations. At any given point in time, that person could have been, purchased something legally, been declared a felon after the fact, and then been declared not a felon, just based on what rules the ATF changed, what wording they changed, what things they allow, what things they don't. And I think the relevant point for that one would be the discussion of constructive intent, which is basically the ATF wanted to say that if you have anything that would be like the part of a gun, that counts as having a gun. So if you have a spring that fits in a gun, then that is the same as owning a gun. And that is an entire long rabbit hole. That is one of the most contentious elements of legal jurisprudence today, and you could read about that all day. Yeah. I'm sorry, I just keep talking today.
Yeah. So the point with these things is, just because the government makes a law, because a court is interpreting a law, and we may not know these things as individual Christian citizens, but we should know our basic rights. And when I've been at conferences and speaking on the topic of the book, and I've had pastors push back and saying, well, what do you know about this? You shouldn't be talking about this. You're not an expert. Yeah, that's exactly why I should be talking about this, and all of us should be talking about these things. We don't have to be experts. What we need to be is we need to go back to being Renaissance men and women who know a little bit about a lot of things and so forth. And so we're not so that we're not calling. I almost had to call a plumber, I thought, because I had to take a cold shower today. I figured it was something small when I went downstairs, and there, the water, the basement wasn't filled with water, like the water heater wasn't bursting or anything. So thankfully, I could just call my son-in-law, and he said, "Okay, here's the little button you need to push to get it restarted." Okay, but uh, if it was a if we fall into that trap of it can only be experts talking about these things, whether it's the law, whether it's health, medicine, whatever it is, we're in a dangerous trap. And so let's move on with this. You kind of mentioned this before, Peter, about trusting in the King of Glory. So in the face of the opposition, in the face of persecution, how is it encouraging to know that Jesus remains the King of Kings and the Lord of armies?
Yeah, I mean, it's very encouraging because this Jesus, he's not a pansy, and he's in charge of everything, and he is the one who has baptized you into his resurrection. And so it's like, what can man do to me? They may take my life, hate, steal, hurt, or kill. Though all may be gone, the victory is won. Because the fact that Jesus is the one who has called you by name, who has sent the Holy Spirit to create faith within your heart, this Jesus is the one who now inhabits heaven and fills all things, body and soul, as God and man. That this Jesus is your advocate, and this Jesus who won't let anything happen in your life that will harm you spiritually, that he will use everything for your eternal good. And this is the Jesus who says, oh, by the way, confess about me, make a confession about me before kings and princes, and I'll use that. Like, that is incredible. That's better than having Superman, Spider-Man, and Wolverine on your side, or whatever the guy with the red, blue, green lightsaber is. Luke, that's it, right?
Oh my goodness. uh, yeah, and I'm going to read a portion of Psalm 24 about the King of Glory comes. Starting with verse 7. Lift up your heads, you gates. Lift yourselves up, you ancient doors, and the King of Glory will come in. Who is this King of Glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, you gates. Lift up, you ancient doors, and the King of Glory will come in. Who is he, this King of Glory? The Lord of armies. He is the King of Glory. That though the kings of the earth, we hear about in Psalm 2, verse 2, how they joined together to oppose the King of Kings, and yet the King of Kings, he is the Lord of armies, the Lord of the angelic hosts. He is the King of Glory, and he still comes in. And the King of Glory, that's one of our congregation's favorite hymns to sing on Palm Sunday. I had to I had to just tell my associate Nathan that, because he did not have us singing The King of Glory Comes. He heard all about it in our midweek Lenten services when he did not have our people singing the Lord's Prayer. And he came the next day and said, man, I'm surprised I'm still in the ministry after that. And then I said, yep. And they may have definitely kicked you out if you didn't have The King of Glory Comes as the last hymn on Palm Sunday. That's just a tradition. And it's important. I think it's important for us in our congregation to sing that The King of Glory Comes. And they took that refrain in the new hymnal and put it also with Psalm 24, paired it nicely, so that as we see our Savior going into Holy Week and we know what's going to happen to him and how he's going to be beaten and bruised and bloodied, and yet by the end of the week, he's going to be raised from the dead because he is the King of Glory. He demonstrates his victory over sin, death, and the devil by allowing the devil to murder him and put him on the cross. And that's the way he allows himself to die, so that he can then win the ultimate victory. And so it's a reminder for us, because Jesus is victorious and they persecuted him, he says in his Gospels, if they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. He beat them, will win too because of our connection to Jesus.
Definitely.
Uh, so, with that, then, Peter, should it be scary that we Christians are living in enemy territory?
Um, I think there is such a thing as healthy fear. Like, should it be scary to walk in the woods at night when you know there are mountain lions around? Probably, because that's the reminder that, well, I should do what it takes to be safe. I should do, hike a little bit more sensibly so that I'm not going to be snuck up on by a giant cat, for instance. At the same time, that healthy fear should be completely counterbalanced and overwhelmed, I suppose, by the fact that, Jesus Christ himself walks with you. That's why I love the hymn, I walk in danger all the way. And you start singing it, and the first three verses are like, I walk in danger all the way, grim death assails me every day. And it's just all these bad things that are going to happen, and people start looking around, like second verse, third verse, like, are we actually singing this? And this is real downer, this is real dour, this is real deadly and dying and death. And but then it transitions to, my walk is heavenward all the way. I walk with Jesus all the way. I walk with angels all the way. There's that clear-eyed understanding of where we stand, both under God's law and that nothing is ours by our own merit, and where we stand, that we stand in enemy territory. This has been enemy territory because woe to the earth, the devil has been thrown down to you, right?
And he's ticked.
And he is irritated.
Yeah, there's a stronger word I would say, that
he's really angry. He's really angry.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that sort of a healthy fear should direct our eyes back to the one who's walking with us, that we've got this bodyguard, we've got this big brother, we've got this Lord of heaven and earth, before whom the demons are terrified, and they are, making all the scared noises of being afraid of Jesus.
Yeah. So it kind of makes me think of my graduation sermon for Shoreline Lutheran High School next Saturday. I'm going to be privileged to preach for my oldest daughter's graduation from Shoreline a number of years ago, and now I'll get to preach for my youngest daughter's graduation next week. And my theme is prove him wrong. And I'm going to tell the story of, a young man, a Navy SEAL, or he's working out to be the Navy SEAL, and his commanding officer on the beach, who's 6'2", and he sees this little guy, I imagine him being my size, and saying, you can't do this. And, because they have to go swimming for miles in the ocean and with 3 and 4 foot waves. And the commanding officer tells him, I don't think you can do this. Can you do this? Sir, yes, sir. And then the commanding officer leans in close and says to the shorter man, prove me wrong. And he proves him wrong. And so I want to use that as my theme throughout my graduation sermon, is to send these young men and women out into a world, into enemy territory. And I'll use all kinds of examples of things that the devil has already thrown at them. But the imagery I want to convey is Jesus leaning in close, whispering into their ear about Satan. Satan doesn't think you can do this. Prove him wrong. And over and over, because we are going into enemy territory. And what I say on page 225 is it is scary stuff that we are Christian soldiers living in enemy territory, but it isn't scary for us. It should be scary for the devil and his allies, because we're on the winning side of the Lord of armies. We're on the winning side of the humble Savior, who was laid in a manger and laid upon a cross, who is the King of glory, seated on his golden throne. If we are going out as soldiers in the Lord's army, and the verse that the seniors chose is Deuteronomy 31 verse 6 about being strong and courageous in the Lord, is, we go out as soldiers, and so we have nothing to be afraid of. If we're strapping on our armor and we're going with the flag of Christ leading us, and all of the angelic host beside us, it should be the devil and his demons that are quaking, not us.
Yeah, and that confidence that says that the Word of God is trustworthy, that Christians don't have anything to be afraid of. The truth has nothing to be afraid of. Jesus Christ, risen and ascended, has nothing to be afraid of. And so when he says, confess my name and I'll, speak my word and I'll use it. Well, of course. Well, try to prove him wrong. Okay. Talk about this Jesus and find a time when he has not used his word.
So with that, I was looking at a workshop for an upcoming conference, and the title of the conference, Peter, is Signals Not to Send. And I'm just going to read the last sentence in the description of this workshop. We will try to hone the skill of challenging our audiences with the grand topics that relate to our current culture without putting a barrier between them and the gospel. And my associate and I were saying, oh, so I should go to a workshop where I am diametrically opposed to what the speaker in the workshop is going to be talking about, because we can guess he's going to say, hey, you can't talk about these controversial things because it's going to turn people off. And well, I like what I wrote in the bottom of page 225. Jesus went into the grave not to become like the dead, but to rescue the dead. We engage the culture, but in doing so, we cannot become the culture. We cannot become like those we're fighting. Then the dragon would have won. Then we have unwittingly become his allies. We go into the depths to rescue people from the depths with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if we're going into the depths to find people who have been trapped by all kinds of these evils about transgenderism and DEI and racism and anti-racism and abortion and so forth, well, that means we have to challenge their thinking on those things. And I know people are going to be terrified about it because you saw the way people are reacting to a lady who was just arrested and tried, given 5 years for being an abortion clinic, and the Harrison Butker, the kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs. They're going to do exactly the same kind of thing to you and me, and we can't be afraid of it. I think what this presenter is talking about is we're going to turn people off. And that's true. But I'm also, I think we can't also hide what we're about. This is one of the things I talk about when it comes to, well, should we celebrate the Lord's Supper on a high festival like Easter? Because
you're inviting everyone.
Yeah, you're inviting everyone. You're going to turn people off. And so my reaction always is, well, I'm going to invite them all back the next week and we're going to have communion. So why not have communion? And on that festival Sunday, when more of our people are going to be there, let people know who we are and what we're about. We should never hide it. Whether it's about the Lord's Supper, whether it's about infant baptism, whether it's about life issues or marriage issues or whatever, we should just come out strong and say, this is who we are. This is what God's word says. Let's go. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, this is our confession. I don't need, because it's a reliance on the means of grace, that I don't need to pretend I'm something that I'm not. I don't need to pretend that I'm like every other evangelical church down the street. And I don't need to pretend that I'm a salesman for Jesus, that I have to make a sales pitch and I have to have the best seats and the best music and the best coffee and everything so that you make a consumer-driven decision to show up. That may be part of your initial marketing, like, hey, come to Resurrection. We've got the best coffee in town. You can find the best coffee in town wherever you want. But here at Resurrection, we've got the means of grace. We've got Jesus himself dwelling among his people to give forgiveness of sins again.
Yeah, and you have to know your audience too. So for example, I might say some stronger things in my sermon on Sunday than I will in the graduation sermon on Saturday at Shoreland, because I know that there's going to be an audience that I may tick off if I say certain things, and they're not going to come talk to me. They're going to go talk to the administration. So I have to know my audience. So yeah, there I may soften things a little bit. I'm not going to focus. I am going to talk about baptism and Lord's Supper to a population in that in the audience that day where half of them are not WELS members that attend Shoreland as students, and then their parents obviously aren't WELS. So I'm still going to talk about it, but I'm not going to come out as strong on some of these things as I would in another sermon, because you have to know the audience.
Mm-hmm.
But then hopefully talking about these kinds of things will say, hey, I like what that pastor is saying, because I'm not hearing those kinds of things in the world. I'm not hearing them in my own church. And I think that's one of the things that we need to be aware of is when we're strong on God's word, we're not afraid to talk about these tough subjects. People are interested in those kinds of things. It's actually a light drawing them out of the darkness instead of a light that's chasing them into the darkness.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you pick your place a little bit because you know your audience, but just because you pick your place and maybe now isn't the time. But, you know, if one of those people comes up to you afterward and says, you know, I was kind of curious about what you said here, Pastor Zarling, that's an entirely different conversation. And to follow it up and say, hey, if you want to hear more about this, here's our churches here in Racine, Kenosha, South Milwaukee, whatever the case may be. I'd love to talk with you about this more. But this is what your grandchild or your child confesses here at Shoreland Lutheran Church or Shoreland Lutheran High School. So talk to them.
Yeah. Anything else you want to talk about with this part?
Nope.
Okay.
I think I've talked enough today.
So, so Lord willing, we will be finishing up the book as we talk about the gates of Hades next week. And then as well as the conclusion, one of the things we'll talk about then is, what have we learned in writing and reading and talking about this book? And so it'd be really helpful for all of you who are listening to, email me, reach out to Peter as well. And then, let us know. No, don't reach out to Peter.
You can.
Let us know some of the things that you've learned from the book, the podcast, and so forth. Because we'll finish it up next week, which would be great timing because the rest of the podcast through the summer may be kind of spotty just because of, Peter and I are very busy people. Probably you more so than I am.
Probably.
Because you got little squirts. All of my girls
You have an
are
associate. You have a secretary.
Yeah, that's right. But I was finally
have
able to get back to biking.
Hey,
So
fantastic.
yeah, I don't know if I'm supposed to be, but just if you don't tell my eye doctor, I think I'll be fine.
Okay.
But he might know next Tuesday when I bike the 20 miles to his office and then get checked out.
He might know by Saturday when he watches the podcast.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Lord's blessings on your week. And the key is, like we talked about, is Christianity is not safe. So just preach the gospel and trust that the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, he is watching out for you. He's going to take care of you as you preach the gospel into the culture.